The Grand Horizon Hotel stood tall in the heart of Manhattan, its windows glowing with golden light against the dark evening sky. Tonight was special because the building hosted one of the most expensive charity events of the year. Inside the grand ballroom, hundreds of wealthy people moved around in their finest clothes, talking and laughing while soft music played in the background. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting sparkles across the room like tiny stars. Waiters in black and white uniforms carried trays of champagne and small fancy foods through the crowd. Claire Bennett stood near the tall windows that overlooked the city. She wore a beautiful emerald green evening gown that fit her perfectly and made her dark skin glow under the lights. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo and small diamond earrings sparkled at her ears. She held a small silver clutch in one hand and smiled politely as people passed by. Claire was 32 years old and carried herself with quiet confidence. She had learned long ago that in rooms like this, a black woman had to be twice as poised and 3 times as careful. People always watched, always judged, always made assumptions. Her husband Richard stood across the room, deep in conversation with 3 men in expensive suits. Richard Bennett was a self-made millionaire who had built his tech company from nothing. He was tall with kind eyes and a warm smile that made people trust him instantly. At 35, he had already achieved more than most people dreamed of in a lifetime. But tonight was not about business for him. Tonight was about the charity that he and Claire supported, a foundation that helped underprivileged children get better education and opportunities. Claire watched Richard for a moment, feeling grateful for the man she had married 5 years ago. He never made her feel like she was less than him, never treated her like a trophy wife the way some wealthy men treated their spouses. He genuinely valued her opinions and always introduced her as his partner in everything. She smiled, thinking about how they had met at a community center where she was volunteering, and he was donating computers. Back then, she had no idea he was wealthy. He had shown up in jeans and a regular shirt, rolling up his sleeves to help set up the equipment himself. The ballroom grew more crowded as more guests arrived. Claire decided to move toward the refreshment area to get some water. Her throat felt dry from the air conditioning, and she wanted a moment to herself before diving back into small talk with strangers. She walked gracefully through the crowd, nodding at people she recognized and smiling at those she did not. The refreshment table was set up along one wall with an ice sculpture in the center shaped like a swan. Bottles of water, juice, and champagne were arranged neatly alongside towers of crystal glasses. Claire reached for a bottle of water and poured herself a glass. The cool liquid felt good going down her throat. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the crowd and feeling slightly tired. These events were important for networking and supporting good causes, but they were also exhausting. Everyone was always performing, always putting on a show of wealth and status. Sometimes Claire missed the simpler days when she worked as a teacher, and her biggest worry was making sure her students understood fractions. She was lost in thought when she heard sharp footsteps approaching. Claire looked up to see a woman walking toward the refreshment table with purpose. The woman was probably in her late 40s with blonde hair styled in a tight updo. She wore a cream-colored designer dress covered in expensive jewelry that seemed to weigh her down. Multiple diamond bracelets clinked on her wrists and a large necklace sat heavy on her chest. Her face had the tight look of someone who had maybe too much cosmetic work done, and her lips were pressed into a thin line of displeasure. This was Victoria Hayes, though Claire did not know her name yet. Victoria was the wife of Gregory Hayes, a businessman who dealt in real estate investments. She was known in certain social circles for her demanding personality and her belief that money made her better than other people. Victoria had grown up wealthy and married wealthy, never knowing what it meant to struggle or work hard for anything. She moved through life expecting everyone to serve her and getting angry when they did not. Victoria reached the refreshment table and stopped. Her eyes scanned the area with annoyance, looking for someone. She tapped her foot impatiently and let out a loud sigh. Then her eyes landed on Claire, who was still standing nearby with her glass of water. Victoria's gaze traveled up and down Claire's form, taking in her beautiful dress and elegant appearance. But instead of seeing a fellow guest, Victoria's mind made an immediate assumption based on the color of Claire's skin. In Victoria's narrow worldview, a black woman at a fancy event could only be one thing. She could only be staff. It did not matter that Claire wore an expensive designer gown. It did not matter that she carried herself with confidence and grace. In Victoria's prejudiced mind, Black people belonged in service positions, not as equals in her social sphere. This assumption had been built over a lifetime of privilege and racism, reinforced by the circles she moved in where diversity was rare and discrimination was often quietly accepted. Victoria snapped her fingers twice in Claire's direction, the sound sharp and rude. Claire looked over in surprise, her eyebrows rising slightly. She had been reaching for another sip of water and was startled by the aggressive gesture. For a second she thought maybe the woman was trying to get the attention of someone behind her. But no, Victoria was looking directly at her with an expectant expression. Claire set down her glass and turned to face the woman fully, waiting to see what she wanted. Perhaps she needed directions to the restroom or had a question about the event. Claire was naturally helpful and did not mind assisting someone even at a social gathering. She opened her mouth to ask if the woman needed something when Victoria spoke first, her voice loud and demanding. The words that came out of Victoria's mouth made Claire's stomach drop and her smile fade away instantly. Victoria pointed at the champagne bottles with one jeweled finger and spoke in a tone that expected immediate obedience. She told Claire to fetch her a glass of champagne right away and make it quick because she did not have all night to wait around. The words came out harsh and dismissive, the way someone might speak to a disobedient dog rather than another human being. Victoria did not say please or thank you. She did not even really look at Claire as a person, just as a servant who existed to fulfill her needs. Claire stood very still for a moment, processing what had just happened. She felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest, the same feeling she got every time someone made assumptions about her based on her race. It happened more often than people might think, even in her wealthy life with Richard. She had been followed in expensive stores, questioned about whether she could afford items, and treated with suspicion in places where she had every right to be. But tonight felt different because this woman was not just assuming, she was demanding. Claire took a slow breath and decided to handle this calmly. She spoke in a polite but firm voice, telling Victoria that there seemed to be a misunderstanding. She explained that she was not a waitress but a guest at the event, just like Victoria. She gestured slightly toward the room where other guests mingled, hoping the woman would realize her mistake and apologize. Claire even managed a small smile, trying to give Victoria an easy way out of the embarrassing situation she had created. But Victoria did not apologize. Instead, her face changed from annoyed to angry. Her cheeks flushed pink and her eyes narrowed into slits. She took a step closer to Claire, invading her personal space in an aggressive way. Victoria's voice got louder, causing a few nearby guests to glance over with curious expressions. She told Claire not to play games with her, and insisted that Claire stop pretending to be something she was not. The words dripped with contempt and disbelief. Victoria went on to say that she knew exactly what Claire was doing. In her twisted logic, she accused Claire of trying to sneak into the event by dressing up in a fancy gown and pretending to be a guest. She said that people like Claire always tried to take advantage and go where they did not belong. The racism in her words was barely disguised. She did not say black people directly, but her meaning was crystal clear. She looked Claire up and down again with disgust and added that the dress was probably borrowed or fake anyway. Claire felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. She repeated that she was a guest and suggested that Victoria check the guest list if she did not believe her. She even offered to introduce herself properly, giving Victoria yet another chance to back down and do the right thing. But Claire could feel her patience wearing thin. She had dealt with racism all her life, but it never stopped hurting. It never stopped making her angry at how unfair the world could be. Other guests were definitely watching now. A small crowd had begun to form at a respectful distance, close enough to see and hear, but far enough to pretend they were not paying attention. Some people whispered to each other behind their hands. A few looked uncomfortable, as if they wanted to say something but did not know how. Others seemed curious, waiting to see what would happen next, like they were watching a television show instead of a real person being humiliated. Victoria refused to listen to reason. She had convinced herself of her version of reality and nothing would change her mind. She raised her voice even more, telling Claire that she was going to find security and have her thrown out of the hotel. She called Claire a liar and a fraud. She said that people like her ruined events for real guests who actually belonged there. Her husband Gregory finally appeared at her elbow, looking nervous and uncomfortable. He touched Victoria's arm gently and tried to pull her away, speaking in a low voice that maybe they should just go get drinks somewhere else. But Victoria shook him off like he was an annoying fly. She was too worked up now, too committed to her false narrative to back down. In her mind, she was doing everyone a favor by exposing this supposed imposter. She probably even felt righteous about it, like she was protecting the sanctity of their exclusive social circle from people who did not deserve to be there. The irony was completely lost on her that her own behavior was what truly did not belong in civilized society. Claire stood tall and refused to be intimidated. She had faced worse than this entitled woman and survived. She had grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant being strong and smart. She had worked her way through college while dealing with racism from professors and classmates. She had built a successful career before meeting Richard, and she had her own money and accomplishments. She did not need Victoria's approval or acceptance. But she also knew that backing down would send the wrong message, not just to Victoria but to everyone watching. Claire spoke clearly so everyone nearby could hear her. She said that she was Claire Bennett, and she attended this event every year with her husband, Richard Bennett. She mentioned that they were major donors to the charity and that she sat on the planning committee. She named several other people at the event who could verify her identity. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the politeness. She was giving Victoria facts, giving her one last opportunity to realize her terrible mistake. Victoria laughed, but it was not a nice laugh. It was the cruel laugh of someone who thought they had all the power. She said she had never heard of any Richard Bennett and that Claire was obviously making up names. She took another step forward, now so close that Claire could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the champagne already on her breath. Victoria had probably been drinking before she even arrived at the event. Her eyes had that slightly unfocused look of someone who had too much alcohol and not enough sense. Then Victoria did something that changed everything. She reached out with both hands toward Claire, and before anyone could react, she grabbed the fabric of Claire's dress at the shoulder. The expensive material was delicate and beautiful, but not meant to withstand force. Victoria pulled hard, and there was a loud ripping sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet space around them. The emerald green fabric tore from the shoulder seam down several inches, exposing Claire's bra strap and part of her shoulder. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people pulled out their phones immediately and started recording. Claire looked down at her ruined dress in shock, her mouth falling open slightly. The gown had cost thousands of dollars and was custom-made for her body. But more than the money, it was the violation that hurt. Victoria had put her hands on Claire without permission, had physically assaulted her in front of all these people. The room seemed to freeze for just a moment, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Victoria stepped back with a satisfied smile on her face, like she had just accomplished something important. She looked at the torn dress and then at Claire's shocked expression, and her smile grew wider. There was something cruel and triumphant in her eyes, the look of someone who believed they had just put someone else in their proper place. She brushed her hands together as if cleaning off dirt, making a show of her disgust. Claire's hand moved to cover the torn fabric instinctively. She held the ripped material against her shoulder, trying to maintain some dignity while her mind raced to process what had just happened. This woman had actually put her hands on her and destroyed her property in front of dozens of witnesses. Claire felt a flash of hot anger run through her body, making her face warm and her heart pound. But she had learned long ago that showing anger as a black woman often made situations worse. People would call her aggressive or threatening, even when she was the victim. So instead of yelling or striking back, Claire did something that Victoria clearly did not expect. She remained calm. Her voice came out steady and cold when she finally spoke, telling Victoria that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Claire said that Victoria had not only assaulted her, but had done it based on racist assumptions and in front of witnesses. She added that Victoria would regret her actions very soon. The words were delivered like a promise, not a threat. Victoria's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. She let out another one of those cruel laughs and shook her head like Claire was a foolish child. Victoria said that nobody would believe Claire over her, that she had connections and money and could make problems disappear. She waved her hand dismissively and added that Claire probably stole the dress anyway and should be thanking her for exposing a thief. The words were so outrageous and mean that several people in the watching crowd made sounds of disapproval. Then Victoria went further, her tongue loosened by alcohol and her sense of superiority. She said that people like Claire needed to learn their place in society and stop trying to climb where they did not belong. She used phrases that danced around directly racist language, but made her meaning perfectly clear. She talked about certain types of people always playing the victim and making everything about race, when really they were just looking for handouts. She said the world would be better if everyone just accepted their station in life instead of trying to pretend to be something they were not. Gregory Hayes, Victoria's husband, looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. His face had gone pale and he kept tugging at Victoria's arm, trying to get her to stop talking and leave before things got worse. But Victoria was on a roll now, energized by what she saw as her own righteousness. She had an audience and she was going to make her point. In her alcohol-influenced state, she could not see that she was destroying herself with every word that came out of her mouth. More phones were out now, recording everything. The crowd had grown larger as people from other parts of the ballroom drifted over to see what the commotion was about. Some guests looked horrified, others looked uncomfortable, and a few seemed almost entertained by the drama. One older woman shook her head sadly and whispered something to her companion about disgraceful behavior. A younger man started typing furiously on his phone, probably posting about the incident on social media in real time. Claire continued to stand tall despite her torn dress and the humiliation of the situation. She refused to give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her cry or lose her composure. Her mind was already thinking ahead to what needed to happen next. This woman had committed assault and had done it for racist reasons. There would be consequences, legal and social. Claire knew she had the resources to make sure Victoria faced those consequences, but more importantly, she had the truth on her side. Hotel security had finally noticed the disturbance and began moving through the crowd toward the refreshment area. Two large men in dark suits pushed politely through the gathering people, their faces professional but concerned. They had been trained to handle situations discreetly without causing a scene, but it was clear that this situation had already gone far beyond discreet. One of them spoke into a small radio attached to his collar, probably calling for backup or notifying management. Victoria saw the security guards approaching and seemed to believe they were coming to remove Claire. She pointed at Claire dramatically and called out to the guards, telling them to escort this woman out immediately. Because she was an imposter who had snuck into the event, she demanded that they check Claire's identification and remove her from the property. Victoria's voice carried across the ballroom, ensuring that even people far away could hear her accusations. But before the security guards could reach them, before Victoria could say anything more, a new figure appeared in the crowd. People began stepping aside to let someone through, parting like water around a stone. Claire saw who it was and felt a wave of relief wash over her, though her face remained calm. She had been handling the situation on her own because she was strong and capable, but she was glad that her partner was here now to stand beside her. Richard Bennett walked toward them with purpose in his step. His face showed controlled anger, the kind that was more dangerous than yelling because it came from a place of complete certainty. He had heard the commotion from across the room and had quickly asked someone what was happening. When they told him that a woman was causing a scene with someone at the refreshment table, he had a bad feeling. That feeling proved correct when he pushed through the crowd and saw his wife standing there with her dress torn and a blonde woman sneering at her. Richard's eyes took in the whole scene in seconds. He saw Claire's torn dress, her dignified stance despite the assault, the phone's recording, and Victoria's triumphant expression. He saw Gregory Hayes looking miserable and the security guards approaching. His jaw tightened and his hands curled into fists at his sides, but like his wife, he knew that violence would only make things worse. Instead, he would use the power he had built over years of hard work and smart business decisions. He walked straight to Claire and placed a gentle hand on her arm, his touch soft and protective. He asked her quietly if she was okay, his voice full of concern. Claire nodded and briefly explained what had happened, her words quiet enough that only Richard and those very close could hear. As she spoke, Richard's expression grew darker. He listened to every word, his eyes never leaving his wife's face until she finished. Then Richard turned to look at Victoria. The woman was still standing there with her arms crossed, looking annoyed that someone else had interrupted her moment of supposed triumph. She opened her mouth to tell Richard to mind his own business, assuming he was just another guest or maybe even more security. But something in his face made her pause. Gregory had gone completely still beside her, his eyes wide with recognition and growing horror. Richard introduced himself in a clear voice that carried to everyone watching. He said his full name slowly and deliberately. He explained that Claire was his wife, and that they attended this charity event every year because they were major donors to the cause. He mentioned the name of his company, a tech firm that most people in the room would recognize. He described exactly what he had been told happened, and what he could see with his own eyes, including his wife's torn dress. The color began to drain from Victoria's face as understanding slowly crept in. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked at Gregory, who refused to meet her eyes, then back at Richard, who watched her with cold fury. Around them, the whispers grew louder as people repeated Richard's name to each other and pulled up information about him on their phones. Claire Bennett, they were saying, was married to Richard Bennett of Bennett Technologies, one of the most successful self-made millionaires in the country. Richard kept his hand on Claire's arm, a gesture that was both protective and grounding for both of them. He could feel the tension in his wife's body and knew she was holding back a storm of emotions. He was proud of her for maintaining her composure in the face of such blatant disrespect and assault. Now it was his turn to make sure there were consequences for what had been done to the woman he loved. Victoria's face had shifted from triumph to confusion to dawning horror in the span of just a few seconds. She tried to laugh it off, the sound coming out nervous and forced. She said there must be some misunderstanding and that this had all gotten out of hand. Her voice had lost its earlier confidence and now trembled slightly. She looked around for support but found none in the faces of the watching crowd. People either looked away or stared at her with disgust and disapproval. Richard's expression did not soften one bit. He spoke again, this time addressing the security guards who had finally reached them. He explained calmly that this woman, pointing at Victoria, had assaulted his wife by tearing her dress. He noted that it was done deliberately and maliciously, and that the motivation appeared to be racist in nature since Victoria had assumed Claire was waitstaff based solely on the color of her skin. Richard's voice remained level and professional, but there was steel underneath every word. The security guards looked uncertain, glancing between Richard, Claire, and Victoria. One of them spoke into his radio again, clearly calling for a manager or someone higher up the chain of command. This was not the kind of situation they were trained to handle on their own. This involved wealthy guests making serious accusations against each other, and any wrong move could result in lawsuits and problems for the hotel. Gregory Hayes finally found his voice and tried to intervene. He stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture and attempted to smooth things over. He apologized on behalf of his wife and suggested that maybe they could all just forget this unfortunate incident and enjoy the rest of the evening. His voice sounded desperate and pleading. He probably already understood how bad this was going to be for him and his business. Victoria's actions would reflect on him whether he had participated or not. But Richard shook his head firmly. He told Gregory that this was not something that could be swept under the rug or forgotten. His wife had been physically assaulted and humiliated at a public event because of her race. He said that Victoria's behavior was unacceptable and illegal, and that there would be consequences. Richard's tone made it clear that he was not interested in negotiating or compromising. This was not about money or social status. This was about principle and justice. Claire spoke up then, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She addressed Victoria directly, looking the woman straight in the eyes. She said that the real problem here was not the mistaken identity, but the assumptions that led to it. Claire pointed out that Victoria had seen a black woman and immediately assumed she must be hired help, that she could not possibly be a guest or an equal. She explained that Victoria had not only refused to accept correction, but had doubled down and gotten physical when challenged. Victoria tried to protest, to offer excuses and explanations. She claimed she had not been feeling well, and that she had drunk too much champagne on an empty stomach. She said she was not normally like this, and that Claire had to understand it was all a big mistake. But even as the words came out of her mouth, they sounded hollow and insincere. It was obvious to everyone watching that Victoria was only sorry because she had been caught, and because her victim turned out to be someone with power and connections. More people had gathered now, forming a large circle around the group. The ballroom had essentially stopped functioning as a party. Everyone was focused on the drama unfolding at the refreshment table. Some people recorded openly on their phones while others tried to be more subtle about it. A few guests who knew Richard and Claire personally pushed forward to offer their support and express their outrage at what had happened. The hotel manager finally arrived, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked extremely worried. He took in the scene quickly and immediately began apologizing to Richard and Claire. He assured them that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated at his establishment and that he would personally ensure the matter was handled appropriately. The manager shot a dark look at Victoria, clearly unhappy that one of his guests had created such a massive problem. Richard nodded at the manager but made it clear that he expected more than just words. He wanted Victoria removed from the event immediately. He also indicated that he would be pursuing legal action for the assault on his wife. He mentioned that multiple people had recorded the incident and that the evidence was overwhelming. Richard spoke like the successful businessman he was, laying out facts and expectations without unnecessary emotion or dramatics. Victoria's face crumbled as the full weight of her actions finally hit her. She reached out toward Claire as if to touch her, but Claire stepped back quickly and Richard moved between them. Victoria's voice went high and desperate as she tried again to apologize. She said she never meant for things to go this far, and that she respected Claire and would never intentionally hurt anyone. The lies were so obvious that several people in the crowd made sounds of disbelief. Claire was not interested in false apologies. She told Victoria coldly that her words meant nothing, because they came from fear of consequences rather than genuine remorse. Claire said that if she had been an actual waitress, Victoria would not be apologizing at all. She would have gotten away with her racism and cruelty because the victim would not have had the resources or platform to fight back. That was the real tragedy, Claire explained, that people like Victoria treated others terribly all the time, and usually faced no consequences because their victims lacked power. The crowd murmured in agreement. Several people nodded their heads, particularly those who understood exactly what Claire meant. A few black guests in particular looked at Claire with expressions of solidarity and support. They had all experienced similar situations in their own lives, whether it was being followed in stores, questioned about their right to be in certain spaces, or assumed to be service workers rather than equals. The hotel manager gestured to security and instructed them to escort Victoria and Gregory from the premises immediately. He announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear that both of them were being removed and would not be welcome at any future events held at the hotel. He apologized again to Richard and Claire, promising that the hotel would cover any costs related to replacing Claire's damaged dress and would cooperate fully with any legal proceedings they chose to pursue. Victoria made one last attempt to resist, raising her voice and demanding to know on what grounds she was being thrown out. She claimed she was being treated unfairly and that this was all blown out of proportion, but her words fell on deaf ears. The security guards took her firmly by the arms, not roughly but with clear authority, and began to guide her toward the exit. Gregory followed behind them, his face buried in one hand, the picture of a man watching his life fall apart in real time. As they were led away, Victoria continued to protest and make excuses. Her voice carried back across the ballroom, growing fainter as she got farther away. Some of her words were about how she was being persecuted and how this was not fair. Other words were attempts at apology that nobody believed or cared about anymore. The crowd watched them go with a mixture of satisfaction and second-hand embarrassment. Once Victoria and Gregory disappeared through the ballroom doors, there was a moment of silence before conversations exploded around the room. Everyone had an opinion about what they had just witnessed. Some people approached Richard and Claire to offer support and sympathy. Others gathered in small groups to discuss the incident in excited whispers. A few guests were already posting about what happened on their social media accounts, the videos and descriptions spreading across the internet at lightning speed. The ballroom buzzed with energy as people processed what they had just witnessed. Richard kept his arm around Claire protectively, while various guests came up to express their shock and support. An older gentleman with gray hair and a kind face introduced himself as Jonathan Price and said he had recorded the entire incident on his phone. He offered to provide the footage to Richard and Claire, for any legal proceedings they might pursue. Richard thanked him and took down his contact information. A woman named Linda Cooper, who served on the charity board with Claire, pushed through the crowd with tears in her eyes. She hugged Claire carefully, mindful of the torn dress, and apologized for not stepping in sooner. Linda said she had been frozen in shock watching everything unfold and felt ashamed that she had not immediately come to Claire's defense. Claire assured her it was okay, and that freezing was a natural response to unexpected situations. But privately, Claire wondered how many other incidents of racism went unchallenged because people were too uncomfortable or shocked to act. The hotel manager returned with a beautiful shawl that he offered to Claire to cover her torn dress. She accepted it gratefully and wrapped it around her shoulders. The emerald green fabric of her ruined gown peeked out from underneath, a reminder of what had happened. The manager also brought the event organizer, a woman named Patricia Hughes, who looked both horrified and furious about the incident that had occurred at her charity gala. Patricia immediately apologized to both Richard and Claire. She said that what happened was absolutely unacceptable and went against everything the charity stood for. She explained that the foundation worked to help underprivileged children of all races and backgrounds, and that having a racist incident occur at their event was deeply troubling. Patricia promised that Victoria and Gregory Hayes would be permanently banned from all future events and that the organization would make a public statement condemning the behavior. Richard nodded but suggested that they take it further. He proposed that this incident could be used as a teaching moment and an opportunity to address the larger issues of racism and discrimination. He said that simply banning Victoria was not enough. The charity should use this moment to have honest conversations about bias, privilege, and how to create truly inclusive spaces. Patricia agreed enthusiastically and asked if Richard and Claire would be willing to help lead that initiative. Claire said she would think about it, but that her first priority was taking care of herself and processing what had happened. More people continued to approach them, and Richard could see that Claire was getting tired and overwhelmed. He politely excused them from the conversations and guided his wife to a quieter corner of the ballroom. He asked her again if she was really okay, looking into her eyes with genuine concern. Claire took a shaky breath and admitted that she was not okay, that she was hurt and angry and exhausted. But she also said she was glad it had happened in a way, because it had been witnessed and recorded, which meant Victoria could not deny it or escape consequences. Richard held his wife close and told her how proud he was of how she had handled everything. He said that most people would have lost their composure or gotten physical in response to such provocation. Claire gave a sad smile and explained that as a black woman, she did not have the luxury of losing control. She said that if she had yelled or pushed Victoria back, people would have seen her as the aggressor despite being the victim. That was the reality of racism, she explained, that victims had to be twice as calm and twice as perfect just to be believed. Around them, the party slowly tried to resume, but the energy had changed completely. The incident had cast a shadow over the evening that could not be easily dismissed. Small groups of guests continued to talk about what they had seen, their voices a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and in some cases, uncomfortable recognition. A few people looked guilty, perhaps remembering times when they had made similar assumptions or witnessed racism without speaking up. One man, a lawyer named Harold Stone, approached Richard privately and offered his services if they decided to pursue legal action. He said he specialized in civil rights cases and would be honored to represent them. Richard thanked him and took his business card, saying they would definitely be in touch. Harold also mentioned that with all the video evidence and witnesses, they had an extremely strong case for assault and potentially civil rights violations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, conversations were happening about Victoria and Gregory Hayes. Several people pulled out their phones and looked up information about Gregory's business. A woman named Susan Morris whispered to her husband that Gregory's company did business with her firm, and that she would be recommending they cut ties immediately. Her husband agreed, saying that no one wanted to be associated with that kind of behavior. Other guests were having similar conversations, the social and business fallout already beginning before Victoria and Gregory had even left the building. Patricia Hughes returned to Richard and Claire with a proposal. She wanted to make a statement right there at the event, addressing what had happened and reaffirming the charity's values. She asked if they would be comfortable with her doing so, not wanting to cause them any more distress or unwanted attention. Claire considered for a moment and then agreed, saying that silence would be worse than acknowledgement. She wanted everyone present to understand that what happened was serious and unacceptable. Patricia took the stage where earlier in the evening she had welcomed guests and talked about the charity's mission. She tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention, and the conversations gradually died down as people turned to listen. Patricia's voice was strong and clear as she addressed the crowd. She explained that an extremely serious incident had occurred this evening, involving racist behavior and assault. She did not name Victoria specifically but made it clear what had happened. Patricia spoke about how the charity worked to create opportunities for all children regardless of their background, and how racism had no place in their organization or at their events. She announced that the individuals responsible for the incident had been removed and permanently banned. She also acknowledged that this was a learning moment for everyone, and that the organization would be taking concrete steps to address issues of bias and discrimination going forward. Several people in the crowd applauded her statement. Then Patricia did something that surprised many people. She invited Claire to come up and speak if she felt comfortable doing so. She said that Claire's voice and perspective were important, and that everyone could learn from hearing her experience. Claire hesitated, looking at Richard, who squeezed her hand supportively and told her it was completely her choice. Claire thought about all the times she had been silent in the face of racism, all the times she had let things go to keep the peace or avoid making others uncomfortable. Claire stood up and walked to the stage with her head held high. The shawl covered her torn dress, but everyone knew what had happened underneath. She took the microphone from Patricia and looked out at the sea of faces watching her. Some people looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few appeared uncomfortable. Claire took a deep breath and began to speak. She thanked Patricia for addressing the incident directly, rather than pretending it had not happened. She explained that racism was not always as obvious as what had occurred tonight, but that this blatant example could help people understand the more subtle discrimination that Black people faced every day. Claire described how she had been assumed to be staff simply because of the color of her skin, despite wearing an expensive gown and carrying herself with confidence. She pointed out that this assumption was not based on anything she had done, but solely on racist stereotypes about who belongs in certain spaces. Claire went on to explain that the most hurtful part was not the mistaken identity itself, but Victoria's refusal to accept correction and her escalation to physical violence. She said this showed how deeply racism was embedded in some people's minds, that they would rather become aggressive than admit they were wrong about a Black person. Claire's voice remained steady and strong as she spoke, though emotion flickered in her eyes. She also addressed the people who had stood by and watched without intervening. Claire was careful not to shame them too harshly, acknowledging that it is hard to know what to do in shocking situations. But she encouraged everyone to think about what they would do if they witnessed racism in the future. She said that silence was a choice, and that people with privilege had a responsibility to use their voices to support those who were being targeted. Claire reminded them that she was lucky to have resources and a powerful husband to stand beside her, but that countless others faced similar situations without any support or recourse. The applause that followed Claire's speech was thunderous and sustained. People stood from their seats in a spontaneous standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Many had tears in their eyes, moved by Claire's eloquence and the raw truth of her words. She had taken a horrible experience and transformed it into a teaching moment, speaking with grace even while describing the pain of discrimination. Claire returned to Richard's side feeling emotionally drained but also strangely empowered by having used her voice. Outside the hotel, Victoria and Gregory sat in their car in tense silence. Gregory's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He had not started the engine yet because he was too angry and shocked to drive safely. Victoria sat in the passenger seat crying, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She kept saying it was not fair, and that she had not meant for any of this to happen. Gregory finally exploded, yelling at her about how she had just destroyed everything they had built. He reminded Victoria that his business depended on relationships and reputation. He told her that people had recorded her racist behavior and assault, and that by morning the videos would be everywhere. Gregory said the clients would drop them, business partners would distance themselves, and they would become social pariahs. Victoria tried to defend herself, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that people were overreacting. But even she seemed to know deep down that her excuses were empty. Gregory started the car and drove them home in angry silence. Victoria alternated between crying and trying to justify her actions. She said she had been having a bad day and that Claire should have just told her who she was from the beginning. She blamed the alcohol and the stress of maintaining their social position. She claimed that she was not racist and that everyone was judging her unfairly based on one mistake. But Gregory was not listening anymore. He was already thinking about damage control and how to salvage what he could from the wreckage his wife had created. Back at the gala, the event slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the atmosphere remained subdued. People continued to discuss what had happened in hushed tones. Many guests sought out Richard and Claire to express their support and to thank Claire for her powerful words. Several influential people promised to use their own platforms to speak out against racism and to share what they had learned from the evening's events. By the time Richard and Claire left the hotel, it was nearly midnight. They drove home in quiet contemplation, both processing the events in their own ways. When they arrived at their penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Claire finally allowed herself to fully feel the emotional weight of what had happened. She broke down crying while Richard held her, whispering comforting words and telling her how strong she was. They stayed like that for a long time, finding comfort in each other's presence. The next morning, Richard woke early to discover that the incident had indeed gone viral overnight. Multiple videos had been posted on various social media platforms, each one showing Victoria's racist assumptions and her physical assault on Claire. The clips had been viewed millions of times already and were being shared widely with comments expressing outrage and disgust. News outlets had picked up the story and were running segments about racism at high society events. Richard made coffee and scrolled through his phone, reading article after article about the incident. Many pieces praised Claire for her composure and her speech at the event. Journalists and commentators were discussing the broader issues of racism and discrimination, using what happened as a launching point for important conversations. Richard felt proud of his wife, but also angry that she had to endure such treatment in the first place. Victoria's identity had been discovered quickly by internet users who recognized her or did research based on the videos. Her full name, photos, and information about Gregory's business were being shared widely. Their social media accounts had been flooded with angry messages, and they had both deactivated them by morning. But the internet never forgets, and screenshots and archived versions of their posts were being examined for evidence of past racist behavior or problematic statements. Gregory woke to discover that his phone had dozens of missed calls and messages. His business partners were panicking. His clients were demanding meetings, and several organizations he was involved with were asking him to step down from his positions. His email inbox was full of messages ranging from disappointed to furious. Some people were already terminating contracts and canceling projects. The business he had spent years building was crumbling around him because of his wife's actions. Victoria stayed in bed with the covers pulled over her head, refusing to face the reality of what she had done. She had looked at her phone briefly and seen the hateful messages, the videos of herself acting terribly, and the articles calling her racist and violent. She could not understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. In her mind, she was the victim of an overreaction and of people being too sensitive about race. She could not or would not see that her own actions and beliefs were the problem. The Charity Foundation released an official statement condemning Victoria's behavior and announcing that both she and Gregory were permanently banned from all future events. The statement praised Claire's grace under pressure and reaffirmed the organization's commitment to equality and respect for all people. The foundation also announced that they would be implementing new training programs for staff and volunteers about recognizing and addressing racism and discrimination. Several board members of companies associated with Gregory's business began reaching out to him, requesting emergency meetings. Some were more sympathetic than others, but all were concerned about the public relations nightmare. A few suggested that Gregory make a public statement denouncing his wife's behavior and committing to anti-racism work. Others were more blunt, telling him that unless he took dramatic action, they would have no choice but to sever business ties. Gregory spent the morning in his home office making phone calls and sending emails, trying desperately to contain the damage. He issued a public statement apologizing for his wife's behavior and stating that her views did not represent his own or his company's values. He announced that Victoria would be seeking counseling and education about racism and unconscious bias. He pledged to make donations to civil rights organizations and to implement diversity training throughout his company. But many people felt his statement was too little too late, and that it only came because he was facing consequences. Meanwhile, Richard contacted the lawyer Harold Stone, who had offered his services at the gala. They had a long conversation about the legal options available. Harold explained that they could pursue criminal charges for assault, civil charges for damages, and potentially a civil rights lawsuit. He said the video evidence made their case extremely strong, and that Victoria would have difficulty defending her actions. Richard told Claire about the conversation and said the decision was ultimately hers since she was the victim. Claire thought carefully about what she wanted to do. Part of her wanted to pursue every legal avenue available to make Victoria face real consequences. But another part of her was tired and did not want to spend months or years dealing with court proceedings and reliving the trauma. She told Richard she needed some time to think about it and to discuss it with him before making any decisions. Richard supported whatever choice she made and reminded her that she did not owe anyone anything, that her well-being came first. As the day progressed, more consequences emerged for Victoria and Gregory. His company's stock price began to drop as investors worried about the scandal's impact on business. Several major clients announced they were taking their business elsewhere, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. Organizations that Gregory had donated to or been involved with began quietly removing his name from their materials and returning his contributions. Social media continued to buzz with discussions about the incident. Many people shared their own experiences with racism and discrimination, using the hashtag that had emerged around Claire's story. Some criticized the focus on one wealthy woman's experience, arguing that poor and working-class people of color faced worse treatment every day without any platform or recourse. Others defended Claire, saying that racism affected Black people at all economic levels and that her story could help open eyes among wealthy white people who might not otherwise pay attention to these issues. The weeks following the incident brought wave after wave of consequences for Victoria and Gregory. The videos continued to circulate online, gaining new viewers daily as news outlets and social media influencers shared the story. Some people created commentary videos analyzing Victoria's behavior and discussing the broader implications of everyday racism. Others made the incident into memes and jokes, though many people criticized this approach as trivializing a serious issue of racial violence. Victoria attempted to issue her own public apology through a written statement, posted on a newly created social media account. The statement was carefully worded, likely written with help from a public relations consultant. She claimed that she was deeply ashamed of her behavior and that it did not reflect her true character. She said she had been going through personal struggles and had made terrible choices while under the influence of alcohol. She promised to seek therapy and education about racism and to become a better person. But the apology was met with widespread skepticism and criticism. People pointed out that Victoria had shown no remorse in the moment, only becoming apologetic after facing consequences. They noted that she blamed alcohol and personal problems rather than taking full responsibility for her racist beliefs and violent behavior. Some people dug through old social media posts and found other instances where Victoria had made insensitive or discriminatory comments, proving that this was not an isolated incident but a pattern of behavior. One particularly damaging piece of evidence came from a former employee of a boutique where Victoria shopped regularly. The woman came forward with stories about how Victoria had treated staff members, particularly those who were people of color. She described Victoria demanding to be served only by white employees and making derogatory comments about other customers. The employee said she had stayed quiet before because she needed her job, but seeing Victoria's behavior at the gala had given her the courage to speak out. Other people who had encountered Victoria over the years began sharing similar stories. Gregory's business continued to suffer as the scandal showed no signs of dying down. A major investment deal that had been in the works for months fell through when the other company's board of directors decided they could not afford the association. Two of Gregory's business partners requested to dissolve their partnerships, not wanting their own reputations damaged by connection to the scandal. Several employees at Gregory's company resigned, saying they did not want to work for an organization associated with racism. The financial losses mounted quickly. Gregory hired a crisis management firm to help rehabilitate his image, but even they struggled to find an angle that would satisfy the public. The firm suggested that Gregory distance himself from Victoria publicly, perhaps through separation or divorce. Gregory resisted this idea initially, whether out of genuine loyalty to his wife or fear of what a divorce might cost him financially. But as the pressure increased, he began to seriously consider it as a business decision. Victoria's life had become a nightmare of isolation and public hatred. She could not leave her house without being recognized and confronted. Someone had posted her address online, and protesters occasionally gathered outside their home with signs condemning racism. The couple had to hire private security to protect their property and themselves. Victoria's friends from her social circle stopped calling and inviting her to events. Women who had once competed for her attention now wanted nothing to do with her. The psychological toll on Victoria was significant. She spent most of her time inside, watching television or scrolling through endless negative comments about herself online. She told Gregory that she felt like a prisoner in her own home, and that the punishment did not fit the crime. She still maintained that people were overreacting and that she had been treated too harshly. This inability to truly understand what she had done wrong frustrated Gregory even more and widened the growing rift between them. Meanwhile, Claire and Richard were dealing with the aftermath in their own ways. Claire had given several interviews to major news outlets, using the platform to discuss broader issues of racism and discrimination. She spoke eloquently about how bias operated at all levels of society, and how people needed to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. She emphasized that while her wealth and status had given her some protection and recourse, many Black people faced similar or worse treatment every day, without any support or justice. Richard had been contacted by numerous organizations asking him to speak about allyship and how to support partners and colleagues who face discrimination. He agreed to some of these speaking engagements, always making sure to center Claire's voice and experience rather than his own. He talked about the importance of believing people when they describe their experiences with racism and of using privilege and power to create consequences for discriminatory behavior. The legal process moved forward, as Claire decided to pursue both criminal and civil charges against Victoria. The criminal case for assault was strong given the video evidence and multiple witnesses. The civil case sought damages not just for the destroyed dress but for emotional distress and the violation of Claire's civil rights. Harold Stone, the lawyer representing them, was confident they would prevail on both fronts. Victoria's legal team tried to negotiate a settlement, hoping to resolve the matter quietly and avoid a trial. They offered to pay for the damaged dress and additional compensation in exchange for Claire dropping the charges and signing a non-disclosure agreement. But Claire refused, stating that accepting money to stay quiet would only protect Victoria from accountability. She wanted the legal process to play out publicly so that others would think twice before engaging in similar behavior. As the court dates approached, more evidence came to light about Victoria's past behavior. Former friends came forward with stories about racist jokes and comments Victoria had made in private. Staff members from various establishments described her pattern of treating service workers with disdain, particularly those who were not white. The prosecution built a strong case, showing that the incident at the gala was not an anomaly but the inevitable result of years of unchecked prejudice and entitlement. Gregory finally made the decision to file for separation from Victoria, releasing a public statement saying that he could no longer be associated with her views and actions. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some people praised him for taking a stand, while others criticized him for abandoning his wife to save his own reputation. Many pointed out that he had benefited from and enabled Victoria's behavior for years and was only distancing himself now that it was convenient. The separation did little to save Gregory's business in the short term. The damage had been too extensive and too public. He was forced to sell several assets to keep the company afloat and laid off a significant portion of his workforce. His personal wealth took a major hit as well, particularly with the expensive divorce proceedings that followed the separation. Gregory's life had been fundamentally altered by his association with Victoria's actions, even though he had not been the one to commit them. Victoria faced the legal proceedings largely alone. Some of her family members had distanced themselves from her, embarrassed by the scandal and unwilling to be publicly associated with her. Her mother stood by her, but even that relationship was strained by disagreements about Victoria's behavior and her inability to fully accept responsibility. Victoria hired an expensive legal team, but they struggled to mount an effective defense against the overwhelming evidence of what she had done. The story continued to generate discussion and debate about racism, privilege, and accountability. Some people felt Victoria was being punished too harshly and that the public outrage had gone too far. They argued that she had made a mistake and that the internet mob justice was cruel and disproportionate. But many others, particularly people of color who had experienced similar discrimination, felt that Victoria was simply facing consequences that most racists never had to face. They saw her downfall as rare and necessary accountability. Claire watched all of this unfold with complicated emotions. Part of her felt satisfaction that Victoria was facing real consequences for her actions. But another part of her felt exhausted by the ongoing attention and the way her traumatic experience had become public entertainment. She told Richard that while she did not regret speaking out or pursuing legal action, she was ready for the story to die down so they could return to some semblance of normal life. 6 months had passed since the incident at the charity gala, and the world looked very different for everyone involved. The criminal case against Victoria had concluded with a conviction for assault. The judge had been particularly harsh in sentencing, influenced by the clear evidence of racial motivation behind the attack. Victoria received community service hours, mandatory counseling sessions focused on racial bias, and a substantial fine. More importantly for Claire, there was now a legal record of what had happened, a formal acknowledgement that Victoria's actions were wrong and criminal. The civil case had settled out of court after Victoria's lawyers realized they had no hope of winning at trial. The settlement amount was significant, though the exact figure remained confidential per the agreement. Claire and Richard donated the entire settlement to organizations fighting racism and supporting victims of hate crimes. They made this donation public, wanting people to know that this had never been about money for them, but about justice and accountability. Victoria's life had been completely transformed by the consequences of her actions. She had lost her social standing, her marriage was ending in a bitter divorce, and she had become infamous as an example of entitled racism. She completed her court-ordered community service at a homeless shelter, where she worked alongside people from diverse backgrounds. Whether the experience genuinely changed her perspective, or whether she simply learned to keep her prejudices hidden, remained unclear. Some people who worked with her reported seeing glimpses of growth and self-reflection, while others felt she still did not truly understand the depth of her wrongdoing. Gregory had managed to salvage some of his business, though it was a shadow of what it had been before. He sold the company to a larger firm and took a behind-the-scenes role with no public-facing responsibilities. He had learned a painful lesson about the consequences of standing by while someone you love behaves terribly. In interviews, he spoke about his regrets and his own journey of examining his complicity in Victoria's racism. Some people believed his transformation was genuine, while others saw it as calculated reputation management. But the most significant changes were happening with Claire and Richard. They had channeled their energy and resources into creating something meaningful from the painful experience. They established a new initiative called the Dignity Project, a program designed to support minority entrepreneurs who face discrimination in traditional business and financial systems. The project provided business training, mentorship connections, and seed funding to help people start and grow their own companies. The launch event for the Dignity Project was held at a community center in a diverse neighborhood, deliberately choosing a location that felt accessible rather than exclusive. Unlike the fancy hotel ballroom where Claire had been assaulted, this space felt warm and welcoming to people from all backgrounds. Several hundred people attended, including aspiring entrepreneurs, community leaders, established business owners who wanted to help, and members of the press. Claire stood on the small stage looking out at the crowd with genuine warmth in her eyes. She wore a simple but elegant dress, nothing as fancy as the torn gown from that night 6 months ago. Her speech was powerful and personal, beginning with an acknowledgement of the incident that had led to this moment. She explained that while she wished the assault had never happened, she was determined to transform the pain into something positive that would help others. She spoke about the reality that Black entrepreneurs faced, the statistics showing how difficult it was to get funding and support compared to white business owners. Claire described meeting talented, hardworking people with brilliant ideas who were constantly turned down by investors who could not see past their own biases. She explained that the Dignity Project aimed to level the playing field even just a little bit, to give deserving people the chance they had been denied elsewhere. Richard spoke next, addressing the men in the audience and challenging them to be active allies rather than passive observers. He talked about his own learning process, acknowledging that as a white man he had privileges that Claire did not have despite their equal wealth and status. He emphasized that being a good partner meant standing up, speaking out, and using whatever power and influence you had to support and protect your loved ones and strangers who faced injustice. His words were well received, with many men nodding in recognition and agreement. The event featured presentations from the first group of entrepreneurs who were receiving grants and support from the Dignity Project. There was Marcus, a young man with an innovative app idea that had been rejected by countless investors. There was Nina, a woman who wanted to open a bakery serving traditional foods from her culture. There was David, who had a plan for affordable housing construction in underserved neighborhoods. Each person shared their story and their dreams, their voices filled with hope and gratitude for being given a real chance. Claire and Richard spent time talking with each entrepreneur individually, asking questions about their businesses and offering advice from their own experiences. The couple had decided to be hands-on with the project rather than just providing money from a distance. They wanted to build real relationships and truly understand the challenges these business owners faced. The conversations were rich and enlightening, reminding them both why this work mattered so much. As the event wound down, Claire found herself in a quiet moment near the windows overlooking the street. She watched people leaving, talking excitedly about the possibilities ahead of them. A reporter approached and asked her how it felt to turn such a negative experience into something positive. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. She said that what happened to her was terrible and traumatic, but that she had resources and support that helped her survive it. She explained that her real motivation was all the people who faced similar or worse treatment every single day without any platform or recourse. Claire emphasized that the Dignity Project was just a small start, that it could not fix systemic racism or inequality, but she hoped it would make a difference in individual lives and maybe inspire other wealthy people to examine their own biases and use their resources to create positive change. She stressed that accountability for bad actors like Victoria was important, but building systems of support and opportunity was equally crucial. Both consequences and solutions were needed to address the deep roots of racism in society. The reporter asked if Claire had any message for Victoria. Claire paused, thinking about the woman who had assaulted her 6 months ago. She said that she hoped Victoria would genuinely learn and grow from what happened, but that her transformation or lack thereof was not Claire's responsibility or concern. What mattered more was ensuring that the next person who faced discrimination would have more support and more options than victims had before. Claire wanted the focus to be on moving forward and creating change rather than dwelling on one person's downfall. That evening, Victoria sat in her small apartment watching news coverage of the Dignity Project launch on television. After the divorce, she could no longer afford the luxurious lifestyle she had once taken for granted. She lived simply now, working a regular job and attending her court-ordered counseling sessions. As she watched Claire speak with such grace and purpose, Victoria's face showed a complex mix of emotions. There was shame, certainly, as she saw the woman she had assaulted doing something meaningful while Victoria's own life had shrunk to something small and isolated, but there was also something that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding. Victoria had spent months in therapy examining her beliefs and behaviors. The counselor had pushed her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and the racist assumptions she had carried through life. It was painful work, and Victoria often resisted it, but slowly some awareness was seeping in. She was beginning to understand that Claire had not deserved what happened to her, that the assault was not a mistake or an accident, but the result of Victoria's own deep-seated prejudice. Whether Victoria would continue this journey of self-examination or whether she would eventually revert to her old ways remained to be seen. Change was possible, but it required consistent effort and genuine desire to be better. The world would be watching to see if Victoria's transformation was real or just another performance. But in the end, her personal growth or lack thereof was less important than the broader changes happening because of what she had done. The Dignity Project grew over the following months, helping dozens of entrepreneurs start or expand their businesses. Success stories emerged as people who had been rejected elsewhere found support and succeeded. The program received additional funding from other wealthy donors who were inspired by Claire and Richard's example. Other organizations began creating similar initiatives, recognizing the need for more equitable access to business resources and opportunities. Claire continued to speak publicly about racism and discrimination, becoming a respected voice on these issues. She used her platform carefully, always trying to center the experiences of people who had less privilege than she did. She spoke at universities, corporations, and community organizations,